I came home after a double shift at the hospital, and my 8-year-old daughter, Emma, was missing. The silence in our Charlotte estate felt like a crime scene. My mother, Angela, didn't even look up from her coffee. She just said, "We voted. You don't get a say." My sister Kayla was already gutting Emma's room, replacing my daughter's drawings with a sterile beige influencer aesthetic. I didn't scream. I didn't break down. I just stood there in my scrubs, stayed calm, and said this: have you ever been voted out of your own life by people who were supposed to love you? Drop a comment with a red heart emoji if you're standing your ground today. We voted. The words hung in the humid air of the hallway, as heavy and stagnant as a summer storm in North Carolina. I watched my mother, Angela, take a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. She looked satisfied, like a politician who had just passed a bill in a rigged assembly. Across the hall, my sister Kayla was tossing Emma's stuffed animals into a plastic bin with the same care one might use for discarded trash. My body was screaming for sleep, my brain still vibrating with the clinical hum of the hospital monitors. But as I looked at them, the exhaustion didn't turn into tears, it turned into a sharp, cold focus. In the emergency room, when a patient is flatlining, you don't panic, you don't ask why the heart stopped, you act. My compassion had been a luxury. They had overdrafted for years, and now the account was closed. I didn't argue. I didn't ask how they could send an 8-year-old child to a man who had treated her like an optional subscription for nearly a decade. I just stepped closer, my voice dropping to that level, factual tone I use when delivering a difficult prognosis. "You're right, Mom," I said, and for a split second, a flicker of smug triumph crossed her face. Decisions have been made. And since you're so fond of voting, I think it's time we look at the only vote that actually carries legal weight. I turned my gaze to Kayla, who was currently peeling a Reach for the Stars sticker off the wall. "Kayla, stop stripping the room. You won't be needing it for a studio." She let out a sharp, bright laugh. "Madison, didn't you hear?" Mom and Dad agreed. "I need the space for my brand. You're never here anyway." "I heard you," I replied, my hand steady, as I walked toward my own bedroom. "But you're confused about whose space this is. This isn't a family democracy. It's a property." I went straight to my dresser, ignoring my father, Thomas, as he barked about respect and family obligations. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the thick manila folder I had kept hidden for years, the one they had begged me to sign, the one they had called a mere formality when they were drowning in debt and couldn't qualify for a parking permit, let alone a mortgage. I walked back into the hallway and held up the deed. "This house, every square inch of this beige-painted nightmare is solely in my name," I said, my voice cutting through their sudden silence like a scalpel. "I took on the liability. I cleared the arrears. And as the sole owner of this estate, I am exercising my right to vacate the premises." Angela's face went from red to a ghostly, sickly pale. "You can't do that," she stammered, the coffee cup trembling in her manicured hand. "We're your parents. You stopped being my parents the second you decided my daughter was an inconvenience," I said, my voice clinical and lethal. "I want you out of my house. Now, because you used this property to commit identity fraud and document forgery, I am bypassing the standard notice. I'll have the sheriff and my legal team here to oversee your emergency departure by the end of the week." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't stay to watch the frantic calculation begin behind their eyes. I grabbed my keys, turned my back on the vultures, and walked out the front door into the Charlotte sun. The lock clicked behind me, a final, metallic period at the end of a long, toxic sentence. I gripped the steering wheel, the cool leather, a sharp contrast to the heat of the anger pulsing in my temples. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just breathed in the scent of my own clinical antiseptic and realized that my life had been a balance sheet, where I was the only one ever making deposits. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a realization that I'd been the silent investor in their version of family for far too long. For decades, I had been operating under the delusion that if I were useful enough, I would eventually be loved. But in that house, love wasn't a feeling, it was a contract. I was footing the bill for. When they were drowning, I was the one who cleared $135,000 in their unsecured debt. I was the one who wired $40,000 in mortgage arrears just to keep the bank from taking the keys to their throne. I had handed over $50,000 of my hard-earned savings as a down payment on their survival. In return, they gave me a room for my daughter that they eventually decided was just an inconvenience. Every month, I was the one paying $4,500 to keep a roof over the very people who just voted to make my child homeless. As I drove, I realized I had been living in a house with no iron bars, a prison without bars. It was a psychological enclosure built from my own sense of obligation and their bottomless entitlement. I was the useful daughter, the one who stayed late, the one who paid the bills, the one who solved the problems before they even had to be spoken. Kayla was the special one, the creative spirit, who was allowed to be fragile because I was expected to be stone. My parents didn't want a daughter. They wanted a primary care provider. They didn't have to pay. I had been trapped by the chains of the survivor, convincing myself that enduring their toxicity was a mark of my strength. I thought that by clearing their debts, I was buying our way into a happy ending. But you can't negotiate with people who treat your involvement like an optional subscription. They didn't see my attending surgeon's salary as a tool for our collective future. They saw it as a limitless overdraft protection for their own greed. The house transfer they had begged for the mere formality was the final link in that chain. They thought that by putting the house in my name, they were just using my credit score. They never imagined I would actually use the deed. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I looked at the folder in the passenger seat and felt a strange, cold clarity. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. I was simply repossessing the life I had paid for in blood, sweat, and 100-hour work weeks. They wanted to hold a vote? Fine. I had the only ballot that mattered, and the results were in. The era of the useful daughter ended at 11:03 a.m. My phone started vibrating against the center console, like a trapped insect. I didn't need to look at it to know the vultures were already circling the digital carcass of our relationship. I pulled into a quiet corner of the hospital parking lot, not for a shift, but for the silence. When I finally swiped the lock screen, the sheer volume of the assault was staggering. 27 missed calls from my mother, 16 from my father, and a notification from a social media alert that made my blood run cold. Kayla was live. I tapped the link. There she was, my sister, sitting in the very hallway I had just walked away from. She had her ring light set to a soft, sympathetic glow, a strategically placed box of tissues on the floor beside her. I never thought I'd have to make a video like this, she whispered to her 400,000 followers. Her eyes were red, but her mascara remained perfectly intact. My sister, a surgeon who is supposed to be a healer, is throwing our elderly, sick parents onto the street. She's trying to steal the family home over a paperwork technicality. And well, the comments section was a digital bloodbath. Heartless, one user wrote. Report her to the medical board, said another. I watched Kayla wipe a tear that hadn't actually fallen and realized that for her, our family was just another piece of content to be monetized. She wasn't grieving a sister, she was optimizing a crisis. She didn't care that I was the one who had kept the roof over her head while she was busy building a brand on a foundation of my credit. She just cared about the viral reach of her victimhood. Then came the barrage of texts from my mother, Angela. They were a masterclass in gaslighting, delivered with the speed of a surgical drill. Madison, think about what you were doing. We only moved that house into your name to protect the family from the bank's mistakes. It was a temporary agreement. You are behaving like a thief. Another one followed seconds later. Your father's heart can't take this stress. If he collapses, his blood is on your hands. Call us immediately and tell us this was just a mistake. I stared at the screen, trying to summon the old familiar weight of guilt, but there was only a chillingly flat clarity. I wasn't a thief. I was the insurance policy they had cashed in years ago. They weren't shocked by what they had done to Emma. They weren't even sorry. They had sent an 8-year-old child away, like a piece of unwanted luggage. They were only shocked that I had stopped being the silent investor in their entitlement. My mother's messages weren't a plea for family unity. They were an audit of a failing revenue stream. Some people forget who raised them, Angela posted on her public profile, tagging every distant relative and family friend in Charlotte. I watched the likes and angry reactions climb and felt my pulse remain perfectly level. They were trying to shame me into the old role, the one where I paid the bills and swallowed the insults. But I had spent too many years in the emergency room to be intimidated by a performative tantrum. In surgery, when a limb is gangrenous, you don't try to negotiate with the infection. You amputate to save the patient. I didn't answer a single text. I didn't record a rebuttal video. I just sat in the dim light of the car and watched the notifications scroll by. They thought they were winning the war of public opinion, but they were playing a game of emotions while I was moving into a game of facts. My compassion had been a luxury. They had overdrafted for far too long, and now the account wasn't just closed, it was being liquidated. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a clinical disposal of toxic waste. I ignored the digital noise. In the hospital, you learn to tune out the alarms that don't signify a code blue, so you can focus on the one that does. My code blue was Emma. I didn't drive back to the estate. I drove 40 minutes north to David and Susan's house. David was my ex-husband's father, a man who had spent 30 years as a high school principal and had the kind of stare that could make a grown man feel like he was back in detention. When I pulled into their gravel driveway, my heart was finally starting to beat again, though it felt like it was hammering against a wall of ice. Susan opened the door, just a crack. Her expression was hard, her eyes scanning my scrubs with a look of pure disdain. "Madison," she said, her voice flat, "your parents said you were overwhelmed. They said you made a decision for Emma's stability? They even showed us a text message from your iPad saying you were on the verge of a mental health crisis and needed Emma out of the house immediately to avoid traumatizing her with your burnout. I didn't make a decision, Susan. I was never asked," I said, my voice projecting that clinical authority. That usually stops a panicked relative in their tracks. My parents held a vote while I was saving lives on a double shift. They moved my daughter out of her own home like she was a piece of furniture they no longer had room for. "Let me see her." Susan hesitated, but David appeared behind her. He didn't say a word. He just opened the door wide enough for me to pass. I found Emma in the kitchen, sitting at a table that was too big for her, her small hands wrapped around a cup of cold cocoa. She looked brittle, like she might shatter if the air in the room shifted too quickly. When she saw me, she didn't run. She didn't cry. She just stared at me with a terrifying, hollow hope. "Hi, baby," I whispered, kneeling beside her. I reached for her hand, but she flinched. "Grandma Angela," she said, "you didn't want me anymore." Emma's voice was a tiny, broken thread. She said you were too busy with the hospital and that you told them to bring me here because I was making you too tired. The air in my lungs turned to lead. I looked up at David and Susan, who were watching from the doorway. This was the work of my own mother, a woman I had kept financially afloat for years, now poisoning my child's mind to justify her own greed. This was the power illusion of the empty wallet. My parents had spent so long living off my resources that they had developed a delusional sense of authority. They had zero equity, zero legal standing, and zero moral ground, yet they acted like kings because I had allowed them to hold the scepter. They mistook my financial support for a surrender of my motherhood. They truly believed that because I paid for the walls, they owned the people inside them. "Emma, look at me," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "That was a lie. A cruel, ugly lie. I came home looking for you. I've been looking for you since the second I walked through the door. I am never too tired for you. You are the only reason I do anything." Slowly, the tension left her shoulders. She leaned into me, and I felt the weight of her entire world shift back onto my shoulders. I stood up, holding her hand so tightly it probably hurt, and looked at David. "I'm taking her. We're staying at a hotel. I'll have my attorney contact you if there are any issues with your son's custody agreement. But as of right now, she's coming with me." David nodded once, a slow, solemn acknowledgement. "We thought we were helping a child who had been abandoned, Madison. If we had known the truth..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the regret in his eyes was real. I walked Emma to the car, buckled her in, and drove straight to a hotel near the medical center. No beige walls, no influencer studios, just a quiet room with 2 beds and a door that locked from the inside. Once Emma was asleep, I sat by the window and opened my laptop. I didn't look at social media. I searched for the one name that mattered now, Richard Brown, the most aggressive real estate and family law attorney in North Carolina. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a recovery operation. The next morning, I met with my attorney, Richard Brown. His office smelled of old paper and expensive coffee, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic echo of the hospital. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He slid a tablet across the polished mahogany desk, his face a mask of professional gravity. Madison, we were preparing the eviction papers for the Charlotte estate, but my digital forensic team discovered something during a preliminary sweep of the household network, something that elevates this far beyond a property dispute. He tapped the screen, showing me a series of digital footprints originating from the studio Kayla had so eagerly set up in Emma's room. She hadn't just been filming wellness content. She had been using my medical license number and my digital signature to endorse a line of unproven metabolic reset supplements. I stared at the forged documents, my pulse remaining chillingly level. My sister had authorized bulk orders of questionable additives, marketing them to her 400,000 followers as surgeon-approved miracle cures. Everything I had built since I was 18, the 100-hour work weeks, the sleepless nights, the weight of every life I'd held in my hands was being used as a prop for a scam. Kayla was monetizing my reputation to sell snake oil, likely using the very computer and high-speed internet I paid for every month. This wasn't just ungratefulness, it was a criminal betrayal that turned a family dispute into a calculated illegal act. She's been committing felony identity fraud and practicing medicine without a license by using your credentials to prescribe those supplements, Brown said, his voice as factual as a lab report. Based on these timestamps, your mother and father were present during several of these endorsement recordings. They didn't just know. They were the production crew for her fraud. I rubbed my eyes, not out of exhaustion, but for clarity. Anger wasn't loud anymore. It was clinical. I realized I had been the silent investor in a criminal enterprise, masquerading as a family. My compassion had been a resource they had overdrafted for years, and now they were trying to bankrupt my entire future. My sister was a pathogen, and my parents were the host. I want the medical board notified immediately that my credentials have been compromised, I told him, my voice precise and lethal. Then, file a formal criminal complaint. We aren't just evicting them anymore. We are providing the evidence for their prosecution. I looked out the window at the Charlotte skyline and felt a profound sense of closure. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. The prison without bars they had built for me was finally crumbling. They thought they could vote my daughter out of her room, but they had actually voted themselves into a prison cell. This wasn't revenge. It was a necessary surgical intervention. The special daughter was about to learn that when you play with a surgeon's life, you're the one who ends up under the knife. The hospital at 2 p.m. is a machine of controlled chaos, a place where the air smells of industrial floor cleaner and the quiet hum of professional urgency. I was standing in the corridor near the surgical wing, my mind focused on a patient's recovery plan, when the sound of my name, being barked at the nurse's station, shattered the clinical silence. I didn't have to look to know it was Angela and Thomas. They didn't belong in a place of healing. They were the infection. They marched toward me through the lobby, waving the eviction documents like a declaration of war. My mother's face was a blotchy mask of fury, her designer handbag swinging like a weapon. My father looked like he'd been chewing on bitterness for 48 hours straight. "Explain this, Madison," Angela hissed, her voice climbing to a frequency that made the staff stiffen and patients look out from their rooms. "How dare you? How dare you send lawyers into our home and treat your own parents like criminals?" 5 minutes, I said, my voice as sharp and precise as a fresh blade. "That is all you get. I am on a shift, and unlike the three of you, I have actual responsibilities." I led them to a side corridor near an empty consult room, far enough from my patients, but close enough for the hospital security guard to keep them in his sights. The hospital calm settled over me, the kind of absolute stillness you need when a patient is flatlining. And every move must be clinical. "You scammed us," my father snapped. stepping into my personal space with the same bullying posture he'd used since I was a child. You used a legal loophole. You stole our house after we spent 30 years building a life there. We raised you in those walls. I stole it? I asked, a short, dry laugh escaping me. I cleared $135,000 of your unsecured debt. I saved you from $40,000 in mortgage arrears when the bank was ready to lock the doors and throw your belongings onto the sidewalk. You begged me to take the deed because your credit was a smoking ruin and you couldn't qualify for a library card, let alone a refinance. I put my entire future and my credit on the line for you. I took on a monthly payment of $4,500 while you were busy voting my daughter out of her own sanctuary. Angela's eyes flashed with a desperate, ugly entitlement. We are your parents! We made a difficult decision for the family's stability because you were never there. We needed that room for Kayla's career. It's about the brand, Madison. You made it for Kayla's studio, I countered, my voice flat and lethal. For your comfort, for a version of reality where I am just an interest-free loan with a medical degree. But you made a fatal mistake when you touched Emma. You dumped her at David's and told her I didn't want her. You told an 8-year-old child she was a burden to her mother so you could have space for a ring light and a camera. Thomas stepped closer, his jaw tight, his voice dropping to a threatening low. You're throwing your family away for a piece of property? You're heartless. You're a stone. This isn't just about a house, I said. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes as I shifted from the property dispute to the real killing blow. While you were helping Kayla gut Emma's room for her wellness content, did you know she was using my medical license number? She forged my signature to endorse unproven metabolic cures to her followers. She put my career, my license, and the life of every person I treat at risk just to collect influencer revenue. And according to the digital timestamps, you and Mom were in the room while she filmed those fraudulent ads. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. My mother's mouth opened, but no words came out. The committee in charge of my life was gone. In their place were two people who realized they weren't just losing a house, they were looking at a criminal investigation. I'm done, I said, nodding to the security guard who was now standing 5 feet away. You've used your 5 minutes. My attorney is handling the rest. Don't come back to this hospital and don't look for Emma. You don't get access to her. Not now. Not ever. You voted her out of your life. Now I'm voting you out of mine. I watched them be escorted out, still shouting, still reaching for the old roles they had forfeited. Power isn't loud. Power is walking back to your unit, knowing you've finally removed the rot. The eviction didn't take 30 days. Once the legal team presented the evidence of forged medical signatures, my family vanished from the Charlotte estate in less than a week. I didn't move back in. The house held too many echoes of their entitlement and that sterile beige invasion. Instead, I rented it out for $4,500 a month. Every cent now goes into a trust for Emma's future and a small clinic I am helping to establish for children who have survived emotional exploitation. I haven't answered a single text or call since that day at the hospital. I chose total no contact not as a punishment, but as a preservation of my own sanity. My mother, father, and Kayla are now living in a small rental they can barely afford, with Kayla still trying to rebuild a digital brand that was exposed as a criminal fraud. Right now, I'm sitting on a porch overlooking the coast with Emma. The only sound is the rhythm of the tide, not the noise of people trying to vote us out of our own lives. To those of you listening who have always felt like the outsider or the useful one in your own family, this is your reminder that you don't owe your light to people who only want to use it to find their own way. Breaking a toxic bloodline isn't an act of cruelty. It's an act of survival. You are allowed to reclaim your narrative and shine without anyone's permission. If you've ever found the strength to say no to a toxic family, you aren't alone. Subscribe to join a community that celebrates self-respect. Share this with someone who needs to find their fire today.